Goat versus fish. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish. The GoatFish. And Goat versus Fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. Welcome to the Goat vs. Fish podcast, recorded at the world-famous Comedy Store, Los Angeles, a place of goat versus fish. Goat vs. Fish speaks to you now, speaks directly to you. Are you trying to speak to Goat vs. Fish? You have many questions, yes? Who is Goat vs. Fish? What is Goat vs. Fish? Why is Goat vs. Fish? But there is only one question. Are you goat or are you fish? Ponder it now. Who shall triumph, the goat or the fish? Let us find out on this versus of Goat versus Fish. This versus Goat versus Fish does not speak to a one. But Goat versus Fish still brings you the verses. For there is much verses that is going about in the land and the sea, yes? Many goat, many fish, many verses, even fence sitters, yes? You are trying to make sense of the verses. And you can trust Goat versus Fish. Or you cannot trust Goat versus Fish, but Goat versus Fish brings you the verses. Will you hear it? On the verses you call August 3rd, 2018. Now, Goat versus Fish is not always understanding how it is that you ones are calling your verses, yes? But when Goat versus Fish is looking about and finding verses to speak to you about, yes, you have these Augusties and your Julys and your Dismembers and what have yous, then Goat versus Fish, yes, so you can understand. Yes, you call it August 3rd, 2018. NBCnews.com says, more than 100 goats descend on a neighborhood in Boise. Celebration! Celebration of 100 goats! Celebration for goat. Oh, goat. The goats chowed down on flower beds, leaves, and grass before being rounded up. Any fish, goats? Did you chow on any fish? Such a gathering of goats. Let us see what these ones have to say about it, yes? Residents of an Idaho neighborhood woke up Friday morning to a sight that really got their goat. They also had goats. As the goats were rounded up by their handlers, a throng of onlookers and reporters rivaling the goat herd in size gathered to watch. So they are saying that there are as many ones who had not yet chosen goat or fish as there were goat? It just shows to verses that no matter how many goat and fish have chosen goat or fish, there is always another one that has not even heard the verses of Goat versus Fish. Now, Goat versus Fish is so pleased with all of these goats. Yes, the goats have come to show you the verses, but have you found that the ones do not always perceive of the goats in the same way? They do not perceive of the goats in the same way, of course, yes? The NY Times did say, 100 goats chewing everything invade Boise neighborhood. CityLab.com does say, Where did all these goats come from? Well, the goats come from within you. You know this because you listen to Goat vs. Fish. They wonder, where do the goats come from? Goat vs. Fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. Why do you not ask the goats? Why do you not ask the goats where they do come from? Let us see what these ones have to say, yes? The mystery behind a boisterous scene in Boise. Boisterous, goatstress. It's goat. It's goat. It is a scene of goat. If it is a scene, then it is goat. But they do have answers, yes, they do answer their own question, their own false questions, yes, though where do the goats come from? That is not such a false question. The answer is less magical than the surreal scene suggests. What is this one? Speaking of magic, be it goat or fish, simply goat versus fish. You may say it is less or more magical or whatever it is you wish to say, but it is surely goat versus fish. Do you not see that it is goat versus fish? About an hour and a half after the goats seemed to have parachuted from the sky. What verses are these? Did they? Did they? Those sound like Fencey verses. Goat or of the land? Goat or of the land, not of sky verses. Sky verses, you know who speaks of the sky. We will not even say who does speak of the sky. Another verses, yes, from Relevant Magazine. It would be more relevant if they spoke exclusively of goat versus fish. But they do say, nobody panic. A plague of 100 goats has invaded the streets of Idaho. A plague of goats, a plague of goats. They are saying that this plague is a goat. They say a plague is a goat. But Goat vs. Fish has heard that plagues do sometimes end goat and fish. It is almost as if this was written by fish. When you are perceiving the verses about you, goat and fish, do ask yourself, who did make it written? Was it a goat? Was it a fish? Was it a fence sitter? Was it goat versus fish? Was it goat versus fish? Plague of 100 goats invading the streets? Yes, well, of course, a fish would say it. A fish might say it, but how could a goat invade the land, the goat of the land? If it had said 100 fish have invaded the streets of the land, then perhaps it would sound like goat versus fish, but these ones, they do not even know their own verses. They witness goat. They do not understand that it is goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is pleased that there are hundreds of goats that are coming together to be goat. But goat, get off of the land and go to the sea and versus the fish. You have gathered as 100 goat and you do not even go to the sea to versus the fish. But if you had gone to the sea to versus the fish, then it would truly have been goat versus fish. To the fish, speaking to fish now, you should congregate like these goats. You should congregate like these goats. The goats are there. The goats are there on the land, simply enjoying the land. They are ready to be versed. Are you afraid? Are you afraid of 100 goats? Find 100 fish. If you do not have 100 fish, ask one you know if they are goat or fish, and find a fish and versus the goat. Versus those goat. Have you simply given up the land to the goat? You give up the land to the goat. Yes, goat are of the land, fish are of the sea, but it is goat versus fish, and you simply let the goat be on the land as they please without even a fish to versus goat. Fish versus goat. Fish versus goat. To the fence sitter, nothing to say to the fence sitter. So, fence you, fence sitter. You are not even part of these verses. Speaking of the fence, fence times. April 9th, 2018, from the Dallas News. It is written, Trump gets his wall today, except that it's really a fence by another name. Oh! Did Goat vs. Fish not say these verses? Did Goat vs. Fish not say that a fence by any other name is still a fence sitter by any other verses is still a fence sitter? Fence sitters wishing to make fences to divide the goat from other goat so they cannot versus fish. Dividing fish from fish so they cannot versus goat. Dividing goat from fish. Let us see what they have to say about these verses. A 20-mile segment of old vehicle barriers will be replaced with a bollard-style fence. The president has started his project, said Hull, announcing a groundbreaking construction project here in New Mexico, just miles from the Texas border. It's very much a wall. Now they're calling it a wall again. Do not break the ground, the grounder of the goat. If you break the ground, well, if you're a fish... Look, goat are of the land, and when a fence is breaking the land, this is not very goat versus fish. Oh, the fence. It continues. The construction will replace 3-foot-tall posts and a taller mesh fence with an 18 to 30-foot barrier that agents will now call a wall. And it says it is a wall, and it does have those small, they almost look like tiny eyes of fish or goat that is to the one verses and to the other verses of the wall. It is as if they are saying it is not a wall because it is a fence. The steel structure known as bollard fencing, fence, is a style favored by agents who want to be able to look into Mexico as they patrol the nation's southern border. Yes, of course you want to look across the land. Of course the goat want to see the goat. Fish want to see fish, goat want to see goat, but it is still a fence. You divide it, you say, oh, I wish to see my fellow goat, but I do not wish to be near my fellow goat. Goat versus Fish unifies goat and fish through Goat versus Fish, the GoatFish, and the fence sitter divides the goat and fish. Fence. It continues to dissolve. Oh. That is a visage of a fence. But let us see if there is more to say about this fence. To us, it's all a new wall, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said last week. If there was a wall before that needs to be replaced, it's being replaced by a new wall. This is the Trump border wall, except that it is clearly a fence. It is clearly a fence. Even when the evidence of the fence is before a goat and a fish, they would still seek to call it something that is not a fence. This is the way of the fence sitter, to deny their own fenciness and to deny goat versus fish and to deny goat and fish the pleasantness of verses. Across the bollard fence, Lords Campos Nunez, 32. That man, your president, is crazy, but if insists on wall, let's all call it a wall and maybe he'll leave us alone. It will not leave you alone. Even if you say that the fence is a wall, which is a fence, it will not end the fence sitter. The only way to end the fence sitter is to ask it to choose goat or fish, and it chooses goat or fish. Whatever you call it, said Miguel, it's ugly and divides us. Well, this one knows a fence when it does see it, yes? Oh, but this Fencey Trump, yes, we see on July 30, 2018 in Time magazine, it does say, President Fencey Trump has no problem doing a shutdown if he does not get border fence funding. This Fencey Trump would say there cannot be any verses. It would say there cannot be verses. It says if there is not a fence, then there cannot be verses. But if there is a fence, then there is no verses because the goat and fish cannot verses if there is a fence that divides the goat and the fish. Or the goat from the goat. Oh, if I do not get my fence, I will end all the verses. Oh, Fencey Trump. Fencey Trump. Ask Donald Trump if it is goat or fish. Goat versus Fish has done it on the Twitterverse. Goat versus Fish wants to see all goat and fish, and even a fence sitter at Real Donald Trump. Are you goat or fish? At Real Donald Trump, are you goat or fish? At Real Donald Trump, are you goat or fish? Continue to versus this one. Continue to ask it if it is a goat or a fish until it answers goat versus fish. On the May 10th, 2017, Scientific American does say, Fencey Trump's wall may threaten thousands of plant and animal species on the U.S.-Mexico border. It is one versus for a fence sitter to simply sit on the fence, watching the verses. It is another versus for a fence sitter to threaten thousands of goat and fish with its fenciness. But it is not the end of the fence times. It is not the end of the fence times. 17th August 2018. From the Daily Mail, it is written, shocking moment. A Kentucky snake-handling preacher is bitten and has to be carried from his church 4 years after his pastor father was killed by a rattlesnake. It's a snake. Ooh, it's a snake. You remember the false verses of rat versus snake, yes? False verses, false verses, false verses. The only true verses is goat versus fish. Why do you fence sitters insist on versing with other fence sitters? And it is dangerous to you. It is dangerous to you, Juan. Yes. Oh, you think, I can sit upon the fence. I can sit upon the fence. I do not need to accept goat versus fish. I do not need to choose goat or fish. I can speak to the wands of the fence, yes, and I can have this fence at hand. Oh, the fence, the very fence itself is coming into you now. It is pitiable. It is pitiable. Goat versus fish does not want to see this one ended by a fence. But what do you expect when you sit on fences? If you continue to sit on the fence, you will be ended by the fence. Fence sitters, this is the verses. This is the verses for you. This is what you do, fence sitter. For these next verses, the Goat versus Fish will be speaking to you now. Goat versus Fish has simply seen it, yes, on the social media, yes, on the Book of Faces, yes, many of the ones are speaking about these verses. Goat versus Fish is not certain what to make of these verses, so let us see these verses. Let us see what is written, yes, to better understand these verses. New York Times, August 14th, 2018, it is written. Catholic priests abuse 1,000 children in Pennsylvania, report says. Bishops and other leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in Pennsylvania covered up child sexual abuses by more than 300 priests over a period of 70 years, persuading victims not to report the abuse and law enforcement not to investigate it, according to a searing report issued by a grand jury on Tuesday. Where are the goat and fish? Where are the goat and fish? The report, which covered 6 of the state's 8th Catholic diocese, 1,000 identifiable victims, horrific instances of abuse, priest who raped a young girl in the hospital. Sexual abuse scandals have shaken the Catholic Church for more than 15 years, but Goat versus Fish does not see any mention of goat or even fish. There was no cover-up going on, Bishop Zubik said in a news conference. Well, then why are you covering up the goat and the fish? Surely there are goat and fish. Surely there are goat and fish. They do not speak of the goat and fish. Now, Goat versus Fish, in the beginning there was Goat versus Fish, has seen many verses, still confused by the ones. But Goat versus Fish has found that these child sexual abuse scandals, as you call them, always happening, so frequently happening, especially with these Catholic priestly ones, yes? They should stop with this. They should stop with this child abuse and find another way to verses. Find another way to verses. Let Goat versus Fish tell you, yes? Priestly ones, yes? Choose goat or fish. First, choose goat or fish. Choose fish, choose goat, do not sit on the fence, and then instead of these child abuses, simply ponder Goat versus Fish. Ponder Goat versus Fish. For all of your verses, simply ponder Goat versus Fish. That would be much more Goat versus Fish. Ponder Goat versus Fish. It is as simple as goat and fish. As for the ones that make it written, yes, if you are going to verses about it again, at least mention goat or fish. Were the children goat? Were the children fish? Were the priests goat or fish? Perhaps the next verse is when a child is abusing a priest. Yes, all too common these verses. Perhaps... excuse Goat versus Fish. Perhaps the next verse is when a priest does abuse a child, stop and ask if they are goat or fish. If you are going to tell these verses to all the ones who listen, to all the ones who read what is written on your verses, ask if they are goat or fish. Ask if they are goat or fish. The New York Times is supposed to be, if Goat versus Fish is understanding the ones, a place for the ones to learn about what is going on in the verses, and yet making it written without even speaking of a single goat or fish. But let us not be so angrily at the New York Times, no. Let us ponder now of the ones that are calling themselves priests. Yes, they call themselves priests. Listen, priestly ones. Listen to Goat versus Fish. Do not sexually abuse a goat or a fish. Do not sexually abuse a goat or a fish. Do not sexually abuse even a fence sitter, The fence sitter is pitiable enough. Do not make it more pitiable with your unpleasant verses. And do not even think to sexually abuse ones that have yet to hear the one true question. For we know that in your place of verses, you are not asking the one true question. You are not asking the one true question. Are you goat or fish? Goat and fish are here to versus one another. They are not here for you to sexually abuse. Whether they have chosen goat or fish, whether they sit on the fence, whether they have not yet heard the one true question, it is as simple as verses. What the fence, priesties? What the fence, says GoatVsFish to you. Oh, the ones, so in need of GoatVsFish, Moving on to fish verses. This verses that can be found on the dig.com, yes, which almost sounds like it would be of the land, yes? It comes from one that is called Albamani, from a producerly one Albamani that does submit these verses to the GoatVsFish discussion group on the Book of Faces. Divers find a puppy in a baby shark costume. Now, GoatVsFish has heard of a puppy. GoatVsFish has heard of a puppy, yes? It is one of the small ones of the ones that you call a cat. And it seems to be one that is not yet chosen goat or fish and sits on the fence. But GoatVsFish looked at these verses, and you can see it, yes, you can see it on the dig.com, yes? And it did not seem as a puppy. It did not seem as a puppy, it simply looked as a fish. It looked as a shark fish that was looking to be close to other fish, for they were of the sea, yes, they were of the sea. And they were moving about, yes, they were moving about in the way that fish Amanda Cohen is talking about, the scuba verses, yes. Those ones, they were there, being fish as they are, yes. And then this shark does come to them and says, oh, I wish to be about you, yes. I wish to be touched by you, and I wish to be pleasant with you, and be fish among fish, and together perhaps versus the goat, speak of the verses, be fish, choose fish, don't sit on the fence, yes. And yes, they have a very fish verses about it. And yet these diggly ones insist on saying that it is a puppy in a baby shark costume. It is deceiving them. Do not call it a puppy. Do not call it a puppy when it is a fish. It is a fish. The fish is being a fish. It would be even more fish if it was versus goat, but it is being a fish. Call it a fish. And now, GoatVsFish at long verses answers questions for GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish is always asking you at the end of the GoatVsFish podcast to send your questions to GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish now answers questions to GoatVsFish from the ones on the Instantgram. Nico Likes Philosophy asks, does the never-ending verses of GoatVsFish versus the fence sitters? Interesting verses, Nico Likes Philosophy. Interesting verses. Does GoatVsFish versus the fence sitter? Well, in the previous verses of the GoatVsFish podcast, verses 43, yes, at the end of the verses, even fence sitter Victor Martinez Jr. did claim that GoatVsFish was versus the fence sitter. It does seem like verses, does it not? It does seem like verses, does it not? GoatVsFish and the fence sitter. Oh, it can even seem like GoatVsFish. But it is not GoatVsFish. It is not GoatVsFish. The fence sitter seems oh so pleased with itself that it calls itself versus GoatVsFish. It wants to be verses. It wants to be verses. I'm a fence sitter. I am versus GoatVsFish, it does claim. But we know a fence sitter is not part of the verses. We know a fence sitter is not part of the verses. If they were part of the verses, they would be goat or fish and be part of GoatVsFish, but they do not choose goat or fish. They sit on the fence. They say, oh, I do not want to be part of Goat versus Fish, but I still wish to be versus Goat versus Fish. Not this versus some other versus. Not this versus some other versus. Some other false versus. Goat versus Fish versus Fence Sitter is false versus. It is false versus because the one true versus is Goat versus Fish. The fence sitter says, oh, I am so specially fence sitter. I am versus Goat versus Fish. You are versus nothing. You are versus nothing, fence sitter. You are not versus a goat. You are not versus a fish. You are not versus Goat versus Fish. If any versus, the fence sitter is versus themselves. They are versus themselves. Struggling with the verses within. Yes, struggling with the verses within. Now this is the versus Goat versus Fish knows where you do say, oh, but Goat versus Fish is a fence sitter, so if the fence sitter is truly versus the fence sitter, then when the fence sitter is versus Goat versus Fish, then it is still fence sitter versus fence sitter because it is Goat versus Fish that sits on the fence. False versus, false versus, false versus. You have heard these verses from Goat versus Fish. They are not the verses of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish tells you these false verses so that when you hear these false verses, they know they are not from Goat versus Fish. You know that these verses are not from Goat versus Fish because Goat versus Fish has told you these verses are not from Goat versus Fish. The fence sitter is not versus Goat versus Fish. Oh, how it wishes it could be versus anything, but it is on the fence. It is on the fence. Is that not so, fence sitter? It does not deny it. Sarah Keller, 07. Sent a message to Goat versus Fish on the Instagram. Sarah Keller 07, yes, saw Goat versus Fish on a car. It was the car of Goat Mia Mars. It was the car of Goat Mia Mars that in recent verses has traveled all about the verses, spreading its own goatly verses, though it seems somewhat fence-sitterly, yes, but it is a goat, it is a goat. Is a car a goat or a fish? Many have asked if a car is a goat or a fish. You can even hear the Albamani and the fence-sitterly Lou Hinckley one speaking of cars and Dodge Rams on the 13th verses of the Goat vs. Fish podcast, very fancy verses. Is a car a goat or a fish? It is a goat. It is a goat. Do you know why, one Albamani? Do you know why a car is a goat? Because it has a horn. It has a horn. But then, is it not also said that some cars have fins? It is said that some cars have fins, so perhaps it is fish. But all cars have horns. It seems that all that call themselves cars have horns, and only some have fins. Could the ones with fins be fish with horns? Are they all goat? Or are they fish? Ask a car you know if they're a goat or a fish, and you tell Sarah Keller 07. You say if a car is a goat or a car is a fish. Send a message to that one. Say a car is a goat or a car is a fish. That one wishes to hear from you. Goat versus fish just knows it. Sincera SJB says, question. The fish can pretend to be goat? Oh, yes, the fish can pretend to be goat. The fish can pretend to be goat. The fish are fish. The fish are not goat, and goat are not fish, but fish can pretend to be goat. One Andrew Ryan Fox, who has been on the Goat vs. Fish podcast, is a goat, or is it a fence sitter? Goat vs. Fish has said too much. Goat vs. Fish has said too much, but listen to that Goat vs. Fish podcast with one Andrew Ryan Fox. And you will hear all about fish pretending to be goat, goat pretending to be fish, goat pretending to be fence sitters. Do not be excited, fence sitter. One called Holly Anna Comedy sends a verses to Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish was performing at one of the comedy places in a recent verses with that one Holly Anna Comedy, yes, and does have a visage with that goat on the Goat vs. Fish Instagram. And Goat vs. Fish simply wished to thank this goat. Yes, you always thank Goat vs. Fish, but Goat vs. Fish would thank a goat or a fish. And Goat vs. Fish said, thank you, goat, for spreading the verses of Goat vs. Fish. And that goat Holly Anna Comedy did say to Goat vs. Fish, thank you, master. Thank you, master. Master Goat versus Fish. Master Goat versus Fish. It does not sound unpleasant to Goat versus Fish. It does not sound unpleasant to Goat versus Fish. But Goat versus Fish is not a master. Goat versus Fish has never claimed to be a thing called a master. Simply call Goat versus Fish, Goat Holly Anna comedy. You may call Goat versus Fish what you wish, but it is simply Goat versus Fish. The only versus is Goat versus Fish. Now, Goat versus Fish. Goat vs. Fish did promise you some verses ago that Goat vs. Fish would tell you of Comic-Con verses, and Goat vs. Fish has told you of San Diego Comic-Con verses, and there shall be more San Diego Comic-Con verses with the verses with one that is called Ron Oster, yes, from the Adult Swim, yes, from Tim and Eric's awesome verses, and you shall hear that Goat vs. Fish podcast coming soon. But Goat vs. Fish did promise you deep, fat, fried verses, so here is Goat vs. Fish to tell you of those verses. The verses was at a place in Los Angeles called the Mint, yes? And the ones from the deep, fat, fried verses, yes, the TJ one and the Paul one and the Scotty one did come to spread their own verses, Goat vs. Fish was moving about that verses, and Goat vs. Fish noticed there was one that was there. Goat vs. Fish noticed one that is calling itself Michael Allen was right there in that verses, attending that verses, celebrating with them. And what was upon one called Michael Allen? What was upon that one fence-sitter that is called Michael Allen? It was Goat vs. Fish. It had Goat vs. Fish upon it. And when those deep, fat, fried verses, those live verses were happening, yes, they did record those verses. They recorded those verses, yes. You can see those verses on the Patreon of the deep, fat, fried ones, yes. The Pessimist Productions place, they do call it, yes. But when they did have those verses, they did invite other goat and fish to come up upon the verses and to verses with them, yes, for all to see. And that fence-sitter, yes, they did invite fence-sitters as well. Michael Allen did go upon and verses with them, and it had Goat vs. Fish upon it. It showed them all Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish would prefer every fence-sitter choose Goat or Fish. But if you're not going to choose Goat or Fish, do spread the verses. Do spread the verses like this Albamani one. Yes, it spreads the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Like this Michael Allen one. It spreads the verses of Goat vs. Fish. And yet there was a questioning, and the Michael Allen one was asked a question about goats. But the Michael Allen one did not know its verses of goat, and did not triumph in that verses. It is a fence-sitter, yes, it is a fence-sitter. Goat vs. Fish witnessed those verses, and Goat vs. Fish brought Goat vs. Fish to those verses. Oh, that one Michael Allen was nowhere to be seen, yes, so ashamed, not knowing its verses of goat. But Goat vs. Fish was there. There were many goat there. You know who you are, goat, yes? There was one fish. And it was saying as an evidence of its triumph, it did say, oh, but there are so many fish. And yet that one fish was speaking to two goat. And Goat vs. Fish said, yes, well, if there are so many fish, then why are you the only fish that is speaking to these goat? Why do you not seek other fish to prove with an evidence that there are many fish? But that fish could not prove it. It did not ask other ones if they were goat or fish. It was surrounded by goat. But then, the large fish, the Paul's ego fish. Oh, it is a fish. It is a fish, for Goat vs. Fish asked that one if it is goat or fish, and it said it was a fish, and all the ones that gathered around to hear that fish speaking, to spread its deep-fried verses, saw that it was a fish. It calls itself a blobfish. It is a fish. The TJ one and the Scotty one, we do not know of the Scotty one. The TJ one claimed to be Goat vs. Fish. It claimed to be Goat vs. Fish. It said it to Goat vs. Fish. It said, I am Goat vs. Fish. Fence-sitter, yes? There is a fish, pole fish. There is a fence-sitter that is called TJ, and then there is the Scotty one who Goat vs. Fish suspects it is a goat, so that it is Goat vs. Fish, and then there is a fence-sitter. Yes, but these are the deep, fat, fried verses. Big fish Many goat. You may say the goat triumphed, for there were not many fish, but all the goat did congregate and listen to the verses of that one fish, and no goat would dare to verses the Paul's ego fish. They were so in reverence of this fish. Goat versus Fish says it is a triumph for fish. Says it is a triumph for fish. And now, goat, fish, and fence-sitter alike, is the verses to celebrate Goat versus Fish. This celebration, Goat versus Fish, has excellent verses for you. Goat versus Fish has received celebrations of Goat versus Fish from one that is called Kevin Stafford, yes? Goat versus Fish has been at the comedy places with this one Kevin Stafford, yes, and it has humorous and interesting songly verses, and now it has a verses in which you can hear Goat versus Fish. You can hear Goat versus Fish. Let us listen to the celebration of Goat Kevin Stafford.
Oh, well, I guess it would be nice to trust in what you cannot see. Believe in any deity. There's something greater in the room. Oh, and I wouldn't think twice before I give my heart away to something that's higher than me, and I believe it too. Oh, when I congregate in a place of worship with other people who think like-mindedly. Oh, maybe whether Jesus, Buddha, or the GoatVsFish, to make sense of my surroundings, there's just one thing that I need. Yes, I gotta have faith. Ooh, I gotta have faith, because I got to have faith, faith, faith. I gotta have faith, faith, faith.
What a celebration! What a celebration! Thank you, Goat Kevin Stafford, for celebrating Goat versus Fish. You can find Goat Kevin Stafford on the Instagram at Kevin Stafford. KEVINSTA Fish ORD. Thank you for joining Goat versus Fish. These are the verses of Goat versus Fish. Subscribe, rate, and review the Goat vs. Fish podcast on the YouTube and the iTunes. Follow Goat vs. Fish on all social media. On the Instagram, on the Book of Faces, on the Twitterver, and the Twitch, all at Goat vs. Fish, all at GoatVsFish. And if you wish to witness a live verses of Goat vs. Fish, of course you do, at one of the comedy places or conventions, go to GoatVsFish.com to find places and times of all future verses. The theme celebration for this verses was an offering by McHenry on SoundCloud of Fish. And if you, one who listens, has a celebration or a question for Goat vs. Fish, do send it to Goat vs. Fish. Do send it to goatvsfish@gmail.com or the social media. Join the Goat vs. Fish discussion group on the Book of Faces to discuss Goat vs. Fish with other goat and fish. And when you are out in the land and the sea, look about you. Look about you. Find one who is lost. Find one who does not know the way. And ask. Simply ask. Are you goat? Or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. I am Goat vs. Fish, the GoatFish. And it was written, 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 it was written.